Racist cop drags black woman, but her quiet warning triggers the shutdown of his whole command post. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jasmine Carter had always known how to keep her cool under pressure, a skill honed through years of training and dedication as an undercover FBI agent. But today was different. As she sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, surrounded by the cold, sterile walls, she could feel the weight of the tension building in the air. The room was filled with whispers, low murmurs of disbelief at the way the officers were conducting themselves. Jasmine was here on a mission, one that would test her nerves, her patience, and her commitment to justice. She wasn't just a bystander today. She was the one who had been observing, waiting for the right moment to expose the corruption hidden beneath the surface of this seemingly lawful institution. The officer at the center of it all, Officer Greg Thompson, was a man whose arrogance had become legendary. He had a reputation for pushing boundaries, for making people feel powerless. But what he didn't know was that Jasmine Carter wasn't just any woman he could intimidate. She was FBI, and as he stood there in the courtroom, his eyes scanning the room with disdain, Jasmine knew this was the moment everything would change. Thompson had made his move first, arrogantly tossing out insults as he glared at the black woman who had dared to stand in his presence. His words were designed to provoke, to belittle, but Jasmine remained silent, unwavering. She had heard it all before. It was a tactic, one she was well aware of. But this time, something felt different. Her intuition told her that this would be no ordinary encounter. As Thompson's words continued to cut through the air, a quiet resolve settled over Jasmine. Her calm demeanor in the face of his provocation was not a sign of weakness. It was her strength. She knew that her silence would speak louder than anything she could say. The officer continued to taunt her, unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. Jasmine wasn't just here to observe. She was here to act, and the time for action had come. With a single, deliberate motion, she reached for her jacket, revealing the FBI badge that had been carefully hidden beneath. The room fell silent. Thompson's smug expression faltered, his eyes widening in disbelief. He had no idea who he'd been dealing with all along. The woman he had mocked was not just another black woman in his courtroom. She was an FBI agent, an undercover investigator who had been tracking the corruption within his department for months. The shock on his face was enough to freeze the room. Jasmine didn't need to say a word. Her identity alone had shattered the illusion of power that Thompson had so confidently wielded. He had underestimated her, and now he would pay the price for it. The truth had been revealed, and it was far more dangerous than anything he had imagined. The shift in power was immediate. Jasmine's quiet warning, her calm presence, had triggered the shutdown of Thompson's entire command post. The officers who had once stood by him, who had laughed at her in the courtroom, now looked at her with newfound respect and fear. Jasmine had exposed the corruption that had festered within their ranks, and the consequences for those involved would be swift and severe. But Jasmine wasn't done yet. She knew this was just the beginning. The real work was about to start, and this time, justice would be served. She had brought down an entire network of corrupt officers, and with it, she had restored a sense of order and fairness that had long been absent. Thompson, once so confident in his power, now stood alone, stripped of everything he had taken for granted. Jasmine Carter had won, not with anger or violence, but with the quiet strength that had always been her greatest weapon. Jasmine stood still, her eyes locked on Officer Thompson as the weight of the room shifted. The smugness that had once characterized his stance dissolved into disbelief. His mouth opened and closed, as if searching for words, but none came. The courtroom, which had been filled with whispers of mockery just moments ago, now sat in eerie silence. Jasmine could feel the change in the air, the tension that was no longer directed at her, but at the officer who had thought he could get away with his actions. With a quiet confidence, she stood, letting the truth of her identity settle into the room. The badge that had once been hidden beneath her jacket now gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. It wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a signal that the game had changed. The officer's confidence crumbled, and for the first time, he was the one who was caught off guard. Jasmine, however, remained calm. Her expression never wavered as the truth unfolded around her. Her silent warning had done its job. There was no need for confrontation, no need for shouting. The shock of her reveal was enough to undo all the power that Thompson had wielded so recklessly. The other officers, who had once stood by him in silent agreement, now looked around uneasily, realizing that the foundation they had relied on was crumbling. Jasmine's eyes swept across the room, taking in the expressions of those who had been complicit in the corruption she had been investigating for months. They had underestimated her, and now they would have to face the consequences. The judge, who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, now looked at Jasmine with a mix of surprise and respect. It was clear that he hadn't expected this turn of events. Jasmine, in her quiet strength, had exposed the cracks in the system that had been left unchecked for far too long. As the silence in the room lingered, Jasmine could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about one officer's wrongdoing. It was about the larger web of corruption that had tainted the system she had sworn to protect. Her job was far from over. Jasmine knew that what she had revealed today was only the beginning. The network of officers involved in the corruption would not simply disappear because of one act of defiance. There would be more work to do, more people to hold accountable, but for the first time, Jasmine could see a glimmer of hope. The shift in power was palpable. It wasn't the result of a violent confrontation or a public outburst. It was the result of patience, of waiting for the right moment, and of acting with quiet authority. She had learned long ago that justice didn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes, it came in the form of a simple reveal, a quiet moment where the truth was allowed to speak for itself. The officers who had once stood beside Thompson now looked to one another, unsure of what to do next. They had seen the power shift, and it was clear that the tide had turned. Jasmine didn't need to say anything. Her presence, her quiet warning, had been enough. As the room began to stir with murmurs, Jasmine remained composed. She knew that the battle was far from over. This moment, this victory, was just the first step in a larger fight for justice. And she was ready for whatever came next. Jasmine stood in the center of the courtroom, her heart still steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts running through her mind. Officer Thompson, once so sure of his dominance, now stood silent, his arrogance stripped away by the simple revelation of her identity. The room buzzed with whispers, but Jasmine remained unmoved, her calm composure creating a sharp contrast to the chaos around her. The officer's colleagues exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do next. Their once silent support for Thompson seemed to dissolve as they looked at the woman standing before them, a woman who had just exposed their colleagues' darkest secrets. Jasmine knew this was the moment she had been working toward. Her mission, one that had brought her undercover into this very space, was now in motion. But even with the powerful moment of revelation, she couldn't afford to relax. This wasn't just about exposing one corrupt officer. It was about dismantling an entire network of misconduct within the police force. Jasmine's years of training as an FBI agent had prepared her for this. She had learned to remain calm under pressure, to read the room and the people within it. The silence in the courtroom, heavy with tension, wasn't something to be feared. It was the moment of control. It was time to act, but not with force. Jasmine knew that the real work was not done yet. The room had seen enough to understand that something had shifted, but the true scale of the problem hadn't been fully revealed. Jasmine's eyes moved across the room, meeting the eyes of those who had been complicit in this corrupted system. She could see the guilt in their eyes, the fear of being exposed themselves. It was a moment of reckoning, one that couldn't be ignored. The judge, still seated at his podium, looked down at her with a new expression. Gone was the indifference that had marked his gaze earlier. Now, there was a quiet respect, even fear. Jasmine knew he understood the implications of what had just unfolded. He had witnessed a shift in power, one that had come not through violence or loud confrontation, but through quiet, deliberate action. The officer who had been so quick to insult her now seemed like a shadow of the man he once was. His face, once filled with self-assuredness, now appeared pale and unsure. Jasmine had done more than just reveal her identity. She had shattered the illusion of control that he and others like him had held for so long. The truth was out, and there was no going back. But Jasmine wasn't done. The officers who had silently supported Thompson were still in the room, and they too had questions they needed to answer. Her role as an undercover agent had only just begun to bear fruit. She knew the investigation wasn't over. The network of corruption that ran deep within the police force was still intact, but Jasmine was determined to break it down, piece by piece. With a steady breath, she turned to face the room, aware of the eyes that followed her every move. She had just shifted the balance of power, but the real work of justice, of holding every single person accountable, was far from over. Jasmine had come here to expose the truth, and she wasn't going to stop until that truth had been fully revealed, no matter how long it took or how many people she had to bring down. This was just the beginning. As the whispers in the room began to quiet, Jasmine's calm voice cut through the silence. "The truth is finally out," she said, her words deliberate, carrying the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. "And now it's time for accountability." Jasmine stood tall, her gaze unwavering as the room slowly shifted back to reality. The tension that had hung in the air, thick and almost suffocating, began to lift. The whispers that had been once filled with mockery were now filled with uncertainty and fear. Those who had once stood behind Officer Thompson now found themselves questioning the very foundation of the power they had always taken for granted. Jasmine could feel their eyes on her, the silent recognition of the storm she had unleashed. But for her, this wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. And justice, she knew, would take time. She could see the judge, still processing what had just unfolded, and the officers who had once felt invincible, now standing in the shadow of their own guilt. Jasmine's role here wasn't just to expose one officer. It was to dismantle a system that had allowed this corruption to fester. The courtroom was no longer just a place for trials. It had become a battleground for the truth. The case was far from over. Jasmine had only just begun to piece together the full extent of what had been hidden. She knew that every action had consequences, and this moment, though powerful, was only the first step in a much larger plan. As the room fell into an uneasy silence, Jasmine made her way to the front, her movements deliberate. She had come here for one purpose: to expose the corruption that had been quietly running through the police force. And now, the first domino had fallen, but there were many more to come. Jasmine knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. She had no illusions about the challenges that lay in wait. The officers who had once been her allies were now her adversaries, and the system she had trusted had failed her. But Jasmine was undeterred. She had been trained to handle the darkest corners of the law, and she wasn't about to back down. The fight for justice was never an easy one, but it was one that Jasmine was ready for. As she stood there, taking in the weight of what had just transpired, she knew that this moment would change everything. Officer Thompson, once the symbol of unchecked authority, now stood exposed, his actions brought to light in a way that could never be undone. The corruption he had been a part of was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was out in the open, and Jasmine was the one who had made it possible. Her eyes swept over the room again, this time with a sense of purpose. She wasn't here to gloat. She wasn't here for recognition. She was here for accountability. The officers who had supported Thompson, knowingly or unknowingly, would now have to answer for their involvement. The truth, no matter how uncomfortable, was now in the hands of those who could do something about it. Jasmine's mission was far from over, but in this moment, she allowed herself a small sense of satisfaction. She had done what she came here to do. The system had been shaken, and now there was no going back. Jasmine knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but she was ready. She had the power of the truth on her side, and that was something no one could take away from her. Jasmine left the courtroom with a steady pace, her mind running through the events that had just unfolded. The weight of her actions was starting to sink in, but she remained calm, her demeanor as composed as ever. There had been a shift, a subtle but undeniable one, and the change she had sparked was only beginning to ripple outward. She wasn't naive enough to think this was over. Officer Thompson's fall was just the start. The network of corruption she had uncovered was vast, and she knew there was still much work to do. Jasmine's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She retrieved it, seeing a message from her superior. "Good work today. We need to talk. Meet me at the office in an hour." The message was short, but it carried the weight of what was to come. She didn't hesitate. She knew what this meant. The real investigation was about to get underway. As she walked through the corridors of the courthouse, she passed officers who avoided her gaze. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the unspoken truth that had been revealed. Jasmine knew the path ahead would be anything but smooth. The people she was dealing with were powerful, and they would not go down without a fight. But Jasmine was prepared. This was what she had trained for. The FBI had taught her to deal with corruption at every level, to move silently, to be patient, and to strike when the moment was right. This moment had been right. The puzzle pieces were finally falling into place. By the time Jasmine reached the parking lot, her mind was already shifting into the next phase of the operation. She knew the impact of today's events would not be immediate. The investigation would take time, but it had to be done carefully. Her actions had already set the wheels in motion. Officer Thompson was just one piece of a larger puzzle. It was clear that he had been a key figure in a much larger web of misconduct within the department. Jasmine had to find the rest of the players. As she drove toward the FBI headquarters, her thoughts returned to the officers in the courtroom. She had seen the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty that had crept in once Thompson had been exposed. That fear was the first crack in the foundation. Jasmine knew how to use that fear. She could feel the shift in the power dynamic. The ball was now in her court. Reaching the office, Jasmine walked through the door, her posture unwavering. Her supervisor, a senior agent named Marcus Reynolds, was waiting for her in his office. He was seated behind his desk, a serious expression on his face. "You did well today," he said, nodding. But Jasmine knew the praise was just the surface. "What now?" she asked. Marcus leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Now we dig deeper. Thompson was just the beginning. We need to expose the whole system, piece by piece. But we have to be careful. These people won't go down without a fight." Jasmine nodded, already feeling the weight of the responsibility that lay ahead. The truth had been revealed, but the fight for justice was far from over, and she was ready for whatever came next. As Marcus outlined the next steps in the investigation, Jasmine felt a sense of resolve settling in. She knew the road ahead would be long, but this time, she wasn't alone. The support of her colleagues and the weight of the truth on her side made her feel more certain than ever. The mission had just begun, and Jasmine Carter was ready to see it through to the end. Jasmine sat at her desk, her mind racing with the details of the investigation. The quiet hum of the office around her only added to the tension she felt building within. The earlier successes had been monumental, but now the real challenge began. The truth had been exposed, but the power structures she was fighting against were far from defeated. The officers who had once stood in solidarity with Thompson were now questioning everything they had believed in. It was time to capitalize on the fear she had created, to build on the cracks in the foundation she had cracked open. But Jasmine knew she couldn't rush. Patience was key. The corruption she had uncovered wasn't something that would fall apart in one swift move. It would take time to piece everything together, to pull back the layers of deception that had been carefully constructed over the years. The FBI was behind her, but she couldn't rely solely on their power. She had to remain sharp, stay ahead of those who might try to stop her. As the investigation moved forward, Jasmine's role became more complex. She wasn't just an agent anymore. She was a target. The people she was after would now be coming for her, and she knew that they wouldn't hesitate to use everything in their power to protect themselves. The thought of the challenge ahead didn't intimidate her. It fueled her determination. She'd already fought battles more dangerous than this one. This was her calling. The truth had to be revealed, no matter the cost. Jasmine glanced at the stack of files in front of her, each one containing a piece of the puzzle she was trying to solve. She needed to find the key players, the ones who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Thompson was just the beginning, and there were more officers higher up the chain who needed to be exposed. Her supervisor, Marcus Reynolds, had made it clear that they had to proceed carefully. The corruption ran deep, and any wrong move could tip off those involved, allowing them to cover their tracks before they were caught. Jasmine's phone buzzed again, pulling her back to the present. It was another message from Marcus. "We got a lead. Meet me at the safe house in an hour." She didn't hesitate. She knew that this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. As she gathered her things, she couldn't shake the feeling that this lead would take them closer to the heart of the corruption. The next phase of the investigation was about to begin, and Jasmine was ready to face whatever came her way. At the safe house, Marcus was already waiting for her. His face was tense, his eyes betraying the seriousness of what they were about to uncover. "We've been digging into the financials," Marcus began, his voice low. "There's a money trail that leads directly to some of the highest-ranking officers in the department. It's time we start bringing them down." Jasmine nodded, her expression hardening. This was the moment she had been preparing for. The truth would come out, and those who had abused their power would face the consequences. As they sat down to go over the evidence, Jasmine felt a surge of determination. The work ahead would be grueling, but she was ready. The wheels were in motion, and the justice they sought was closer than ever. Jasmine sat in the safe house, reviewing the financial documents spread out before her. The evidence was clearer now, too clear to ignore. The money trail led directly to the highest-ranking officers in the department, officers who had long thought they were untouchable. She could feel the weight of this moment pressing down on her. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Marcus sat across from her, his eyes scanning the same files, his expression intense. He had always been calm under pressure, but today there was a certain urgency in his demeanor. "We've got them," Marcus said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "This is it. This is what we needed to bring them down." Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, her mind racing as she processed the details. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about taking down an entire network that had been operating in the shadows for far too long. She had known it would be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated the depth of the deceit. The officers they were after weren't just corrupt. They were entrenched in the system, their influence reaching far beyond what she had ever imagined. "We need to move fast," Jasmine finally said, her voice steady. "If they catch wind of this, we'll lose our chance." Marcus agreed, but there was a quiet hesitation in his eyes. "We need the right leverage," he replied. "Without it, they'll just cover their tracks." Jasmine was already pulling her phone from her pocket. She sent a quick message to a trusted contact within the department. She knew they had to act quickly, but also carefully. There was no room for mistakes now. As she waited for a response, she thought about the journey that had led her here. The undercover work, the risks, the long hours spent digging for the truth. She had sacrificed a lot to get to this point, but it had all been worth it. The pieces were finally coming together, and she was determined to see this through to the end. Her phone buzzed, and she quickly read the message. It was the confirmation they needed. "We've got the evidence," the message read. "It's time." Jasmine stood up, her resolve stronger than ever. "Let's do this," she said, her voice filled with purpose. As she walked toward the door, she could feel the tension building again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was the anticipation of justice finally being served. Marcus followed her closely, the two of them stepping into the unknown together. They had everything they needed to bring down the corruption, but there was no guarantee that the fight would be easy. Jasmine knew the danger that still lay ahead, but she was ready. The truth was out, and it was time to make sure that no one could bury it again. As they left the safe house, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The wheels were in motion, and no one could stop them now. The officers who had once thought they were above the law would soon be facing the consequences of their actions. This was the moment she had been working for, and she was ready to see it through to the end. Jasmine and Marcus arrived at the discreet location where they had arranged to meet their contact. The tension was thick, but Jasmine's focus remained unshaken. She knew the importance of this moment. Everything had been building up to this, and the final pieces were now in place. They needed to act swiftly and decisively. As they approached the back entrance of the building, Jasmine glanced at Marcus. His face was calm, but there was an underlying intensity in his eyes. He understood what was at stake here. This wasn't just about bringing down a few corrupt officers. This was about dismantling a system that had allowed such corruption to persist for far too long. The door opened, and their contact, an officer with the Internal Affairs Division, motioned for them to enter quickly. They moved inside, and the door clicked shut behind them. In the dimly lit room, stacks of files and evidence were spread across the table. The officer quickly began laying out the documents in front of them, each piece of information more damning than the last. Jasmine's eyes scanned the contents. The money trail, the secret meetings, the illicit transactions, it was all here. They had everything they needed to take down the network of corruption that had infiltrated the department. Jasmine felt a surge of adrenaline. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she was ready. This was it. They had the proof. It was time to move forward. "This is it," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "We have what we need. It's time to make the arrests." Jasmine nodded, her mind already calculating the next steps. She knew that they would need to move quickly. If the wrong people caught wind of their plans, it could all fall apart. But Jasmine had never been one to back down. She had come too far, and too many lives had been affected by this corruption for her to let it go now. As the team made their final preparations, Jasmine couldn't help but think back to everything that had led to this point. The countless hours spent undercover, the constant danger, the long nights of chasing down leads. It had all been worth it. The truth was finally within reach. Her phone buzzed once again, snapping her out her thoughts. It was a message from the higher-ups at the FBI, confirming that backup would be in place when they made their move. They were ready. Jasmine felt the tension in the room shift, becoming more purposeful. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back now. As they prepared to leave, Jasmine exchanged a look with Marcus. They both knew the risks. This wasn't just about bringing justice to a few bad apples. This was about ensuring that the entire department knew that corruption would no longer be tolerated. As they exited the safe house and climbed into the vehicles waiting outside, Jasmine felt a sense of resolve wash over her. This was a turning point, not just for the department, but for the city, for the people who had been hurt by the actions of those in power. Jasmine's determination was unshakable. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting to restore faith in the system that had been corrupted beyond recognition. The team moved swiftly through the streets, the destination clear in their minds. Every detail had been planned, every move accounted for. They were on their way to ensure that justice would finally be served. As they neared their destination, Jasmine's heart raced, but she didn't falter. She knew this was the right thing to do. And no matter what happened next, she was ready. Jasmine's team moved with precision, the quiet hum of the vehicles cutting through the streets as they neared their destination. The adrenaline was building, but Jasmine's focus remained unwavering. She had trained for moments like this, moments when everything depended on being meticulous, on staying one step ahead. Every officer, every suspect they were about to confront had been carefully planned for. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but Jasmine carried it with resolve. As the convoy slowed and turned onto a quiet street, she could see the building up ahead. The heart of the corruption, the place where everything had been orchestrated. This was the final step, the culmination of everything she had fought for. They pulled up to a discreet entrance, far from the eyes of the public. The tension in the air was thick, but Jasmine could feel the shift in the atmosphere. This was it. The officers in the vehicles alongside her were all prepared, each person playing their part in this carefully orchestrated operation. Jasmine took a deep breath, steadying herself for what was to come. As she stepped out of the vehicle, her team followed, moving swiftly but silently into position. The building was quiet, but Jasmine could feel the storm brewing inside. She had no illusions about what was at stake. This wasn't just about bringing down a few corrupt officers anymore. This was about showing the world that corruption could no longer hide in the shadows, protected by those who were supposed to serve and protect. The team moved to the doors, where they were met by another contact who had been working on the inside. "Everything's in place," the contact whispered, nodding toward the building's interior. "We're ready." Jasmine's mind raced as she mentally reviewed the plan one last time. They would move quickly, efficiently. There was no room for error. They had the evidence, they had the proof, and now it was time to make sure the truth was heard. She nodded to the team, signaling that it was time to begin. They moved into position, entering the building with stealth and precision. Jasmine's heart was steady, her steps firm as she led the team through the hallways. Every turn, every door was a calculated step closer to bringing this operation to its climax. As they reached the main offices, Jasmine's eyes scanned the area, her senses heightened. She could feel the eyes of the officers around her, the ones who had been complicit in the corruption, but none of them dared to make a move. They knew the game was up. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Jasmine and her team made their way through the building, knocking on doors, flashing badges, and securing the suspects. The arrests were methodical, each one adding another layer of justice to the operation. There was no chaos, no outburst, just a quiet, resolute determination to make sure the law was upheld. When the last officer was in handcuffs, Jasmine stood back for a moment, taking it all in. The building that had once been a hub for criminal activity now stood as a monument to the truth. The corrupt officers who had once held the power were now the ones being led away. Jasmine's phone buzzed once more, a message from Marcus. "We did it. The system will feel this." Jasmine didn't need to respond. She knew that this was just the beginning. The corruption was no longer protected, and the truth had finally found its way into the light. She allowed herself a moment to breathe, but only for a moment. The road ahead was long, but today, justice had been served.